just prepare for this exam. I think it is your preparation that will make the difference. Obviously, you have a lot of resources at your disposal during the exam. If you can prep it, you can make it really efficient to find the answers that you need. So it's going to be very graph heavy. Not that you're going to need to draw graphs, but you're going to need to interpret the graphs. So it's going to be really those graphs from this chapter that you're going to need to be able to look at and tell me, are we profit maximizing? Should we continue to operate in the short run or not? What is the average total cost per unit at our profit maximizing level? Like there's just like all those little pieces of the graph that we talked about. Where's your shutdown point? Where's your break-even point? Things like that, okay? Any questions? All right, let's continue on. This is gonna seem like a lot for 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, but we're gonna finish it up. This is the hardest chapter of the whole semester, in my opinion, and I think most of my previous students would agree. This is an opportunity, because you know it's the hardest one, to spend extra time on it. Remember, your homework for this chapter is due on Sunday, the day before your exam. I wouldn't wait. It's a pretty good sized assignment, and it's going to make you think through all of those things that you need to know for the exam anyway. So the sooner you do it, the sooner you know where your deficits are, and you can study to fill those. So, okay. All right, let's get going. So we talked about perfect competition in the short run. That's what we've been talking about up till this point. We've been talking about shutdowns, break-evens, ATCs, AVCs, MCs, demand curves, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost is where you profit maximize. We've been talking about all of this short run stuff. Well, what happens in the long run in a perfectly competitive market structure is pretty different than what happens in the short run. Remember, your short run is the period of time in which you have one fixed resource. And your long run is that planning horizon where you can change things, where you can increase your scale of operations, decrease it. You can go out of business altogether if you're losing money and you don't think it's going to get any better. Like, you can do all of these other things in the long run. Well, perfectly competitive market structures in the long run are pretty interesting and pretty different. And this is where I'm going to bring back that concept of normal profit that we talked about in the last chapter that I kind of introduced you to. In the long run, in this type of a market structure, remember, firms aren't actually making that much money in this type of market structure because the market is giving you the price. And there is absolutely nothing you can do about it. You're a price taker. You take the price, you leave it. Those are your options. And so it's not like you have an opportunity to make a ton of money by doing some marketing and then raising your price because you've increased demand. Like, you just can't do that, right? In this type of a market structure. So you're kind of at the mercy of it. And so there's just not a lot of profit to be made. When we get to the end of our short run, to our planning horizon, we can make some different decisions. And I can promise you that some firms are going to, depending on whether that market is earning a profit or seeing losses, firms are going to come and go from that market. And remember, that was one of those attributes of this particular type of market, is that firms can enter and exit pretty easily. You can come and go pretty quickly, pretty easily from this type of a market structure. And our example, remember, is wheat, right? If you're not making money in the wheat market, you might try growing corn or soy or something else. You can get out, you can go do something else, right? Or on the flip side, if you see a market that's making profit, you might want to go get into that one. So you might want to leave the one you're in and go and get into another one, or stay in the one you're at and increase your operations. But there's this flexibility to come and go, and that's an important factor here, right? In the long run, firms will come and go. Firms will adjust their scale of operation. So they'll increase the quantity, decrease the quantity they're producing, depending on the profit situation, okay? Remember that all resources are variable in the long run. So we can change anything. We got to plan for it now, right? When we get to the end of our short run, we could have implemented some changes to go into our next short run, okay? Just keep that in mind as we work through this. So the first scenario we're going to walk through is what happens when we get to that long run if we're experiencing economic profit in that market in the short run. So we're seeing profit in the short run, economic profit to be exact, right? If we are experiencing profits, we can expect to attract attention for that. In these types of markets, in perfectly competitive markets, there's not a lot of profit to be had. So if other firms see profit, that's attractive. So when we're talking about this farm example, you know, if a farmer's not making profit growing one thing, but they see that in our market for wheat, we're making profit, they want a piece of that. They want in. It's attractive, okay? So new firms will enter the market if we're seeing profit. Existing firms already in the market, they're not going to leave, right? But they're probably going to adjust their scale of operation instead. They're probably going to increase production instead because they're making a profit. If you're making a profit, let's make more units. See if we can make more profit, right? Clearly, there's good stuff happening right now, and we're going to take advantage of that. Due to that entry into the market, what actually is going to happen in that market when the supply shifts to the right, because we're increasing supply to that market, new firms are entering, and we're probably going to want to make more, the existing firms that are already there. We can expect the supply curve to shift to the right. We can expect the supply curve to increase. And when it does, it actually takes all that profit and erodes every single bit of it. Okay, so let me walk you through that on the board. Okay, so we're in a market. We have supply, we have demand. Okay, we're making money in this market. Firms are chasing the profit. They're entering the market. We're increasing our scale of operations. We would expect, this is our equilibrium. Okay, we would expect the supply curve then to shift to the right. Okay, supply one or supply prime, however we want to look at that. Okay, and we now have a new equilibrium right here. Our price, our market price just went down. So by trying to chase those profits, what all those companies have actually ended up doing is eroding the profits. Well, we're in a new short run, right? We got all these new firms. We've expanded our scale of operation, right? By the time we get through this short run, this is all going to have adjusted. And we're going to now receive a lower price for our good. Everybody is. The profit is going to disappear, right? Because the price has been driven down. We're not making, our costs haven't changed. Our costs have probably stayed the same, relatively, right? And now we're just getting a lower price. Here's what happens in a perfectly competitive market structure in the long run. If you're recognizing profits, it's going to shift the supply curve, drive down the price, profit's going to disappear. And in the long run, everybody's actually going to break even. What do I mean by break even? I mean operate at their break even point. End up with a price that's at break even. Because profits, as long as there are profits in that market, firms are going to continue to come in. The supply curve is going to continue to shift until there's nothing left to chase. Okay? So when I say break even, what I am talking about is the condition of normal profit. Normal profit, when we talked about it in the last chapter, I told you to write right next to it, zero economic profit. That's what's going to end up happening in the long run in a perfectly competitive market structure because of the coming and the going of firms in and out of that market chasing profits, or in the next example, we're going to talk about running away from losses. Okay? All right. So let's talk about the next scenario, which is losing money. This is what happened if firms were making money in the market in the short run. Now, let's do losses. So here's supply, here's demand, okay? Now firms are losing money in the market in the short run. So we're losing money, but some of us are continuing to operate, right? We analyzed that graph on Wednesday. Minimizing losses, should you shut down, should you continue to operate in the short run, etc., right? When I told you that, I said, well, what should we do in the long run? What would be your answer to that? We actually don't know. But when we get to the long run, some firms are going to be out. They're going to be like, I'm out, right? I don't see this thing getting any better. I can't continue to recognize losses anymore. I'm out. And firms will exit the market if the market's experiencing losses. Individual firms are experiencing losses, right? Or maybe if you decide to stay in the market, what you have to do to survive is you have to just reduce your scale of operations, make less in order to try and survive this next short run, whatever, okay? The market supply curve, when we get to the end of the short run, when we get to the long run at the end, firms will leave or adjust their scale of operation down, which is going to decrease supply, which is going to shift the supply curve to the left. Okay, now we went from an equilibrium here to an equilibrium up here. The price has now gone up. Well, that's actually good news for you if you stayed, because that now offsets your loss. Like you had losses, but enough people got out of the market that it shifted the supply curve, allowed the price to go back up, and you don't have to experience losses anymore. So it's actually this sort of natural thing that happens as firms chase profits or try and run away from losses and find profits someplace else. It's this coming and this going that creates this long run equilibrium where those losses in this case disappear because of the price increase. We're now getting more money because remember, we're price takers. So when the price in the market goes up, the individual suppliers get that price, right? It's a great thing. And hopefully, in the end, those firms break even as well. Because remember, firms will continue to move, right? If there's any loss to run away from, some will leave. If there's any profit to go find, they will go find it. And so that will continue until there's no reason to go anywhere, okay? That no reason to go anywhere is actually economic break even. Here's the thing. Will an accountant still tell these firms that they're earning a profit even when they're economic breaking even? Yeah, because remember, accounting profit is so much lower than economic profit. Then an accountant is going to sit there and say, oh, you guys are making a profit, everything's fine. An economist is going to be like, well, actually, you're just breaking even, but it's actually the best you can do in this market structure. Because we take into account those implied or implicit costs, right? Which nobody records. Nobody keeps track of opportunity costs that you've lost, except for somebody who understands econ, right? An accountant's going to be like, oh, you're fine. You're making money. From an economic perspective, they're recognizing normal profit or zero economic profit in the long run in this particular market structure. Okay? That's all they can hope for. It's fine. Okay? All right. So this is just a summary. This is just a summary of those two scenarios that we talked about. And that is this drive to shift the market and how it really just results in zero economic profit in the long run for everyone. So firms enter, leave the market, change their scale of operation, which means they increase their production, they decrease their production, whatever, right? They're just trying to find the best place to operate, profit maximize, right? The supply curve is going to shift because of the coming and the going and changing scale of operation. Supply curve is going to shift one direction or another, which is going to change the price. When the price in the market changes, we get a different horizontal demand curve at a new price, either lower or higher, depending on how the market shifted, how the supply curve shifted, right? So the demand curve shifts, that perfectly horizontal demand curve is going to shift. We end up at a place we call long run equilibrium for this market. I don't want you to get really caught up in that formula there, that long run equilibrium formula, but let me sort of, I think I can give you a glimpse at how to read that MR equals MC equals ATC equals LRAC. Just give me a minute and I'll walk you through it, okay? So let's look at the first part of the formula, the equation, if you will. MR equals MC. You know MR equals MC, right? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So we are, it appears in long run equilibrium, we are at profit maximizing levels. This is as good as it gets for us. Yet, we are just covering average total cost. Do you remember that break-even point we looked at on the graph on Wednesday? That's what we're talking about here. We're talking about that price where we are just breaking even, where we are equal to our ATC. So what we're implying here in LRAC is long run average cost, okay? Don't overthink that. Remember that was that big, thick curve that sort of skimmed to the outside of all of our short run average cost curves, okay? You don't need to overthink this, okay? This is basically just saying this is as good as it gets for us, and we're just covering average total cost. It's break even, okay? We're experiencing that condition of normal profit in the long run, which is equal to zero economic profit. It's still a positive accounting profit, but we don't care about that in this class, right? But it's why the accountants or the management might say, wow, we're doing really, really great, right? Well, yeah, except for you're actually just breaking even, okay? So that's what the long run looks like for perfectly competitive market structure. Now, I'll show you this graph really quick. Don't overthink it, okay? This is just the visual of that equation that I showed you and that I explained to you. MR equals MC. Well, MR, remember, marginal revenue is equal to price or equal to demand. That's just not on that for this particular graph, but MR equals MC is also equal to ATC, is also equal to long run average cost. It's basically like we have costs at their absolute minimum and it's our best position and we're just covering costs. So it's just a visual of long run equilibrium. Don't get caught up in it. I'm not going to put too much weight in you knowing that equation, right? Okay, so now that we're in long run equilibrium, so now we're right here, right? Everything is in long run equilibrium. Economic profit is equal to zero. We are recognizing normal profit. What's going to throw us off of that equilibrium? Well, it's the thing that changes in markets more often than anything else. It's a change in demand. Demand is what shifts markets probably more frequently and more aggressively than anything else, right? Supply is supply. Does it shift? Does it change? Well, sure it does. Demand is about you and me. If there's one thing you and I know how to do, it's change our mind, right? Or decide we want more of something or less of something, or our income changes, or our expectations change, or right? We're the shifty part of this, okay? And so when we get to long run equilibrium, the thing that's going to throw us off again is a change in demand. So we just showed you how, I just showed you how the market adjusts when it's thrown off of equilibrium and how the supply curve shifts to get us back into equilibrium. Well, what throws us off to begin with is a change in demand. So we're sort of taking this a step back and saying, well, what would cause the market to get out of equilibrium to begin with? Okay? So let's talk about the effect of an increase in demand on the market. That's actually what throws it off, change in demand, okay? So the effect of an increase in the market, okay, so let's go back. We have supply, we have demand. Our market is in beautiful long-run equilibrium. And then you and I create a shift in demand for whatever reason, doesn't matter, okay? We do it all the time for really no reason at all. And so if demand for a good increases, right? We're in equilibrium and then demand increases. Well, if demand increases, price is going up. And when price is going up, what are firms in that market going to experience because we've driven up the price? Profit. They're going to experience profit. And when firms in a market start experiencing profit, firms in other markets take notice of that profit because everybody wants it, right? And so then we're experiencing economic profit, and that starts that series of events that we just talked about in a couple previous slides. It's like, what happens when a market is thrown off equilibrium and there's profits to be had? Firms enter the market, supply increases, which drives down price, which erodes those profits, that we only end up with normal profit in the long run. In the short run, we can experience profits. In the short run, we can experience losses in the short run. In the long run, we end up coming back to exactly where we started. Okay? There's just too much incentive for firms to come and go to adjust to the profit. Okay? So I'm now going to show you a graph of this. It's this bad boy right here. Okay? This first graph, this is the equilibrium. This is when we are in long-term equilibrium, right? I showed it to you and I was like, don't worry too much about this. MR equals MC equals ATC equals LRAC. You don't need to think too much about it, right? But here it is, back again. The important thing to notice is that for whatever reason, you and I increased demand, which drove up the price. When we drove up the price, that firm now gets a new demand curve at a new price because it is the market demand that equals the firm demand, okay? Or creates the firm demand. And so we now have a situation where we are producing for a price above break even. This is like us going from, like, if you remember our graph that we went over on Wednesday where we talked about all those different price levels, right? This is like us going from P4 to P5 on that graph. So going from break even point to P5, that profit price, okay? So let's look over here at this second graph, graph B, industry market, and let's look what's going on, okay? We started at point A. We started at point A, that equilibrium. And then our demand curve shifted to the right. I just showed that to you right here, okay? Demand curve shifted to the right, and we ended up here at point B in the short run. Because you and I, we don't wait till the long run to change our demand. We change our demand whenever our demand changes, right? And that happens in the middle of long run, or I'm sorry, in the middle of short runs all the time. So firms are sort of trapped in that short run, right? In this case, they're pretty happy to be trapped there because they're making a profit, okay? So we then went to an equilibrium of B in the short run, where we're getting that higher price. But then in the long run, right, firms are coming in. And I walked you through that graph, right? Firms are coming in, they're looking for that profit, they're looking to steal away the profit. And so because they end up coming in, it then shifts the supply curve to the right in the long run, and we end up down at point C. So we went from A, which is where we started off our short run. That's equilibrium, okay? Then we got that big bump in price because the demand shifted during our short run. So we got to make profits during our short run. But then suppliers adjust by coming and going and chasing that profit, which then shifts the supply curve, and we end up right back where we started from. Do you see that sort of S asterisk there by that solid black line on the second graph? That is the long run supply curve for this market. In the long run, we always come back, right? We can experience losses, we can experience profits in the short run, but in the long run, we always come back and we supply what we supply, okay? All right, any questions? I know it's a lot, guys. All right. Assuming your eyes have not rolled back in your head yet, let's keep going. All right, this is the opposite driver. This is a decrease in demand, right? So this is the thing that throws the market off of its long run equilibrium. It gets back to long run, something happens. Then it gets back to long run again, then something happens. That something is a change in demand. We talked about an increase in demand. Let's talk about a decrease in demand now. Right, we're at long run equilibrium. Everything's perfect in this market, okay? You and I decide now, we don't want as much of it for whatever reason, right? We now have lower wages. There's less people in the market. I'm not sure that would be the reason. But yeah, if a bunch of people moved out of your market, yeah, our taste for the good changed, whatever, price of substitutes, complements, you know, all that stuff, those 5 reasons, okay? But for whatever reason, demand decreased. So demand decreased, okay? So we went from an equilibrium here to an equilibrium here, price went down. So we're now experiencing an economic loss in that market. That market was at break even. We've now taken the price below break even. We're now experiencing losses in that market. Okay, firms will decrease the quantity that they supply at that price. It's what happens, right? Lower price, lower supply, just is, okay? But in the long run, there are firms that are gonna get out. There are firms that aren't able to even cover their fixed costs, whatever, right? And they're gonna get out, especially if they don't see things changing in the long run or in their next short run, right? And so firms will exit this market when they get through this short run. Other firms will adjust their scale of operations, right? They're gonna decrease their quantity supplied. So supply in this market is then going to decrease as firms exit the market. So this decrease in demand is actually then gonna result in another decrease, and that's a decrease in supply. Suppliers just aren't interested, right? But by firms then exiting the market, it will eventually drive the price back up. And so it's in leaving the market that's losing money that those suppliers are actually causing the suppliers who stayed to get a higher price, okay? Because of the adjustment that's gonna happen. In the end, all of these perfectly competitive markets are going to recognize normal profit or 0 economic profit in the long run. So let's look at this graph, okay? Up here, right, we are looking at our equilibrium, our long run equilibrium, this nest of curves, right? This P, this first P was our break even, our P4, if you will, on that previous graph we talked about on Wednesday. And we went from our P4 or our break even down to our P3, maybe lower. I don't really know, right? But we're losing money now. And that's going to create a problem for a lot of firms. Okay, we're now losing money. And so as a result, right, demand decreased. So we went from point A on the second graph down to point F. And then we're going to end up back at point G after the supply curve also decreases. So in the long run, those suppliers get to change their mind. In the short run, you and I change our mind and shift the demand curve at will. And then in the long run, suppliers get to a point where they can make some different decisions. They don't have any fixed resources anymore, and they can make some different decisions, okay? So we go from A to F to G. We end up right back where we started from. And then you can see our long run supply curve is that S asterisk. Okay, just the opposite scenario. Questions? Okie dokie. So let's go on to perfect competition. Sorry, consumer surplus and producer surplus under perfect competition, okay? We've talked about this concept of consumer surplus before. And it was, the example I gave you was you walk into a grocery store with $3 in your hand to go buy a gallon of milk. You get in the store, it's on sale for $2. You were willing to pay $3, you only had to pay $2. The difference is your consumer surplus, right? You put it in your pocket and you go buy something else later with it. Consumer surplus is a beautiful thing in an economy. It creates additional spending. And it is really what consumers get from participating in market exchange. If you and I go to a place where there's market exchange and where we get that market price for goods, chances are there's going to be a bit of consumer surplus, at least for some consumers in that. And that's a positive when we're talking about the economy as a whole. The new concept here for you is producer surplus. Producer surplus is the money that producers get above and beyond what they were willing to accept for their good. There are always going to be some producers who are actually getting more than you would need to give them to produce, right? If this is equilibrium price, all of these producers down here were willing to give you this good at a lower price. They got this one though. And so they end up with extra money in their pocket too. And the beautiful thing about producer surplus, it's good for an economy too. It actually gives producers more money in their pockets that then they can spend on expanding their business, employee bonuses, healthcare, whatever, right? It doesn't matter. Hopefully they're spending it. That's just all we hope, is that they're spending it, because we're pretty sure that consumers, we're talking about consumer surplus, we're pretty sure they're going to spend it. Firms, maybe they don't spend it like we would hope, but they do end up spending their producer surplus, a lot of it, on something. Even if it's CEO bonuses, you know, which is not as optimal, because it doesn't seem to get spent as quickly as other monies, like smaller bonuses to lower level employees. It still gets money out into the economy, okay? All right, so let's talk about a couple other, you know, this is sort of a continuation of that surplus conversation. And the fact that this particular type of market structure is incredibly efficient in terms of economics, in terms of the economy as a whole, okay? So the first thing we get from perfectly competitive markets is we get that surplus, that consumer and producer surplus. We put money in people's pockets because we keep the prices pretty low in those markets. And we put money in some people's pockets, a lot of consumer surplus, a little bit of producer surplus. And that's good stuff. That's good stuff. It produces what we call social welfare. It's good for society. Why is money in people's pockets good for society? Stimulates the economy. It increases people's standard of living. They're able to buy more stuff with the paycheck that they have. That's good, right? By all accounts, that's good. Keeps producers healthy with a little surplus. The other thing we can say, and I already said, it's really, really efficient market structure. Well, it's efficient on a couple of different levels. It's productively efficient. Productivity produced in this type of market structure is high. In terms of, you know, the firms that are operating in this market who are price takers, who have to take these prices, they're trying to be really efficient in the way that they use resources in this particular type of market. Because the profit margins are so small to begin with, they have to be efficient when they're producing. They can't waste a lot in production in this type of a market structure. It's good for an entire economy and the globe, you know, the entire planet, for us to be efficient with our resources, not waste our resources, okay? Because we know they're scarce. But it's also allocative efficient, which means that we do divert sort of disproportionate amounts of resources to this type of production because it's so efficient. So we're giving people what they want and being really efficient with resources at the same time. So giving people what they want at a low price and being efficient with the resources at the same time. Don't overthink that. It's just really efficient market structure. Maybe the most efficient, okay? So maximum amount of social welfare that we see in market structures is typically going to come from this one. What is social welfare? Well, depends on who you ask. There's a lot of different definitions of social welfare, but I would say it's the overall well-being of people in the economy. Obviously, that's subjective. Well, what does that mean, overall well-being? Well, here's what it means when you're talking about it in an economics class, right? More people get more stuff at a lower price. And when it's at a lower price, they have money in their pockets to go buy other things, and they can create a standard of living for themselves that is above what it would be if this was produced in a different market structure, if these goods were produced in a different market structure, okay? We maximize social welfare when the cost of production to the overall economy, there's a cost of production to us as an overall economy. It's the cost that it physically takes to produce for the supplier to produce it. Plus, you know, we have other costs. We have environmental costs. We have other things to consider, right? But it's when the marginal cost of producing a good is equal to the marginal benefit that the consumer receives. This is sort of higher level here, people, okay? We know that we've maximized social welfare. When we have gotten it, when we have been able to extract a benefit for people out of a good that is at least equal to the cost of that good, to the society, to the planet, the economy, et cetera, okay? All right, so let's look at a graph for a perfectly competitive market. Well, at the market level, we still have an upward sloping supply curve and a downward sloping demand curve, right? That's what we've been doing here, okay? They have an equilibrium. That's the price that every producer in that market is forced to take because they're price takers, right? And so in this case, it looks to be $10. And then we have the supply curve. It's upward sloping, exactly like we would expect it to be. It ends at point M. The supply curve doesn't go all the way to the origin. We talked about that in chapter 4. Like, why doesn't a supply curve go to the origin? Well, because there is a certain number at which no supplier is willing to supply anything below. Because it's a losing proposition. That point M there, right, that you see, that $5, where did that come from? How did we derive that? How would we have figured out what the market supply curve looked like and that it ended at point M? If you think back to the lecture from Wednesday and how we come up with market supply curves, why would it end at point M? What's significant about that point? Oh, I want to hear somebody's voice so bad today. What is it about point M? Let's go back to here. Remember, we added up all of the individual supply curves from the individual firms or producers in the market, and that gave us our market supply curve, right? And it ends here because these end here. Well, why do these end here? Well, because, right, nobody's willing to supply below their shutdown point. Well, so that's what that is. It's the shutdown point. This $5 signifies that shutdown price for producers in this market. If you can picture it, right, those AVCs, those average variable cost curves, would be hitting right at point M. Right at point M is where that variable cost curve would be, which means that any price below $5, we would not accept because we're not even covering our AVC. And then that entire area, that yellow area that says producer surplus, is the difference between what some producers were willing to sell us that good for below $10. So between points M and E, those are all points on a supply curve. Supply means suppliers are willing and able to supply at those prices that suppliers didn't have to accept because they got $10. So it ends up being that, I guess it's like a quadrilateral or whatever that's there with the yellow shaded color. It's above supply and below price. It's basically where consumer surplus lies on a graph. And then we see that producer surplus is above price. So that blue area, above price and below demand, because every point on the demand curve above point E, so tracing the yellow demand curve above point E, those are people that were willing to pay more than $10, that were willing and able to purchase at those prices. And they didn't have to. They got the $10 price too. So that distance between what they were willing to pay and the $10 price, that's all the consumer surplus for all of those people. Did everybody get consumer surplus? No. There were people on the demand curve that weren't even willing to pay 10. So they never got any anyway, right? But for those people that were willing to pay more and didn't have to, they got consumer surplus. And that's good for the whole society because that additional spending on different goods creates jobs, creates sort of this multiplication effect of spending throughout the economy. It's good for everybody. Any questions on that? All right, it appears you've all had enough for today. Enough for the week. You have been through the hardest part of this class. Now you just have to understand what you just heard this week.